Welcome to Study Session 3, Understanding National and International Conflicts. Introduction. In this study session, we will examine national and international conflicts. Students must take note of the fact that a central object of violent struggle has been the control of the state. International conflict involves much more than violent or armed collusion. The various approaches to understand both national and international conflict shall be our focus in this study session. Learning outcomes. At the end of this study session, you should be able to 1. Differentiate between national and international conflicts. 2. Highlight causes of national conflicts. 3. Point out causes of international conflicts. Conflict in the state system. It has become generally accepted that the state is a necessity and that rebellion against the state is also inevitable. This statement is paradoxical, but at the same time, it also represents a reasonable line of argument in which the dynamic of conflicts are based. The necessity of a state is informed by the need to organize society in such a way that specific roles will be played by different individuals, and there will be some role relationship between the individuals or the components within the state. The same scenario is more perspective among countries, especially when the presence of power differentials could make one country assume the tendency to exploit others. The swing of power to one side induces tension and conflict, but focus could also be placed on entire social system. In the same vein, there is a general view by scholars that conflict is a normal phenomenon in the interactions among humans, whether acting individually or collectively. National conflict. National conflict arises as a result of the conflicting perspective or preferences of those within it, who are unable to settle dispute peacefully or manage crises that arise. This perspective sometimes leads to extreme situations in which some consider the state itself as a handicapped or evil one. There were those, for instance, of the revolutionary mode, such as Mikhail Bakunin, 1814 to 1876, who contends that the act of destruction is a creative act and the state must be destroyed in order to create statehood. Bakunin advocated the nihilistic tactic of assassination for its effect of psychological terror and the demolition of existing institutions. Also, Enrico Malatesta, 1850 to 1932, an Italian journalist, regarded well-planned violence as a suitable means of educating the working class as to the meaning of revolutionary struggle. Similarly, the French journalist Georges Sorel, 1847 to 1922, perceived value in proletarian acts of violence that served to describe the separation of classes. Such violence, Sorel maintained, helps to develop the consciousness of the working class and the middle class in a chronic state of fear, always ready to capitulate to the demands made on it rather than run the risk of defending its position by resorting to force. It is also the contention of anarchists that violence is required so as to liberate man from the change of statehood. What is anarchism? Anarchism is the doctrine that opposes established political authority in all its forms. Bureaucracy, courts, police, and military, as well as the institutions of private property and religion. They seek liberation from these and all forms of external constraint on human freedom. Furthermore, it could also be said that all revolutions are extra-legal means. To those who believe in creating conflict through the use of violence, it is considered to be a useful instrument of political power, and it has 3 main characteristics. They are: 1. Spontaneous causes from a chance of events. 2. Violence may develop when or because the process of law enforcement has broken down. 3. That it could be as a result of deliberate organization of those who believe that there is a need to change the order of things violently. Similarly, it is the belief and contention of some scholars that we could have revolution that could charter the normal flow of events as a result of the existence of some people who are ascetic. What this means is that when society is perceived as having certain shortcomings, which makes it less fulfilling for some people, the revolutionary ascetic becomes an ideal type to which any individual will only partially correspond. Such individual embodies traits exhibited by most revolutionary leaders which lead to events that are often associated with particular revolutions. Ted Gore, in his book Why Men Rebel, 1970, also tells us both the psychosocial forces, the economic and political environment which conditions the rise of rebels. Gore argued that relative deprivation was the key to revolutions. It is in his view the coming together of a number of forces and causes that actually lead to any rebellion in society. There is also the quest by individuals who are active within a particular system at any given time trying to justify what is in existence or the need to change the existing situation. The attempt to resist this move usually leads to some extent conflict in the society, and this will generate or lead to crisis in the nation. There is the psychological interpretation of the innate force on the individual that has been frequently related to what the psychologists call the libido. This is related to all the instinctual energy and desire that are derived from the id. In psychoanalytical terms, the id refers to the impulses of the unconscious source of energy within the individual. The way this operates in relation with the ego, which is the psychic apparatus that experiences and reacts to the outside world as individual reacts. We also have the superego derived from the punitive aspects of some people's authority. In this case, one could understand why there was a Nigerian civil war, considering the dramatic personnel, the key actors in the war. One can also understand the Ife Modakeke crisis the same way. Also, when conflict erupts on campus, either among cults or some social group, we can seek explanations by tracing it to the perception and idiosyncrasies of the individuals involved. International conflict. Conflict in international relations arises from the desire of two or more nations to attain a goal or achieve an objective which is only possible with one nation. International conflict is viewed from two broad perspectives. It is simply an increase or a change in the type of interaction or intensity in disruptive interactions between two or more countries. Such interactions may result in military hostilities, that is war, which are likely to destabilize the relationship between two or more states and consequently bring about structural changes in the international system. An international conflict could arise from a domestic cause, thereby attracting outside intervention. A domestic conflict which assumes international status involves three or more parties or factional groups, each attempting to protect its interest. International conflict could be the result of demand by one nation for territorial right or resources controlled by another. It also involves an attempt by a nation to impose its military might, religion, political ideology, or economic power over another. International conflict may be as a result of a challenge to the internal structure of a regime or an action that is intended to strengthen the status quo of those in power. International conflict arises from the internal crisis of one or more states. These crises are basically perceived from three interrelated issues of hostile acts, disruptive events, or environmental change. A conflict in international politics is a process of interaction occurring at higher levels of perceived intensity than the ordinary flow of events and characterized by significant implications for the stability of some system or subsystem. Finally, The fact that different interest groups in a social system pursue different goals and have to contend with one another indicates that conflict would naturally erupt. Furthermore, international conflict is a period of stress and danger, which may signal opportunities to advance one's interests. Put differently, it is a recurrent phenomenon generated by long-term economic processes and sudden flare of belligerency among international actors, that is, state and non-state actors. Causes of international conflict. 1. Imperialism. 2. Religious extremism. 3. Ideological factor. 4. Territorial acquisitions or disputes. 5. Economic competition. 6. National prestige. 7. Irredentism. 8. Ethnic hostility. We can say that it is an act of extending one's influence to a foreign country. In his famous tract titled Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Lenin advanced the Marxist thesis: finance capitalism is the source of imperialism. It also becomes for Marxists the principal source of international conflict in the capitalist era. Essentially, imperialism, which is the highest form of capitalism, has remained a dominant feature in international politics. There is the imperialistic type of conflict among the territorialists. Religious extremism. Religious extremism is a potential source of conflict in international relations. Religion is the core of a community's value system in much of the world. People whose religious practices differ are easily not respected and treated as unworthy or even human. According to Goldstein and Peephouse, 2011, religious differences hold the potential to make existing conflicts more intractable because religions involve core values which are held as absolute truth. Without doubt, fundamentalist movements have gained strength in recent decades. It is important to emphasize that members of these movements organize their lives and communities around their religious beliefs. Many are willing to sacrifice, kill, and die for those beliefs. To be sure, fundamentalist movements have become larger and more powerful in recent decades in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, and other religions. It should be noted that the secular practices threatened by fundamental movements include the rules of international system which treat states as formally equal and sovereign, whether they are believers or infidels. As transnational belief systems, religions often are taken as a higher law than state laws and international treaties. For example, Iranian Islamic fundamentalists train and support militias in other states such as Iraq and Lebanon. In the same vein, Jewish fundamentalists build settlements in Israeli-occupied territories and vow to cling to the land even if their government evacuates it. Likewise, Christian fundamentalists in the United States persuade their government to withdraw from the UN Population Fund because of the organization's view on family planning and abortion. Most of these actions run counter to the norms of the international political system and to the assumption of realism. Ottington, 1996, argues that cultural and ethnic differences between civilizations, namely states or groups of states, that distinguish themselves by cultural traits will lead to conflict. These cultural differences are first and foremost religious in nature, although linguistic and geographic proximity also plays a role. Ottington's main prediction is that future conflicts will be fought between Muslims and non-Muslims. Thus, conflict among boundaries between Muslims and non-Muslims as Take 2. Thus, conflict among boundaries between Muslims and non-Muslims as in Philippines, Kashmir, Chechnya, Kosovo, Bosnia, Sudan, Nigeria, and Palestine are seen as proof that Islam has bleeding borders. Currently, violent conflicts are being prosecuted in the name of all world's major religions. But special attention is due to conflicts involving Islamic groups and states. Islamic groups advocate basing government and society on Islamic law. These groups vary greatly in the means they employ to pursue these goals. Most are non-violent, while some are violent. If Islamist movements seek changes primarily in domestic policies, we must ask ourselves, why do they matter for international relations? Islamist politics may lead to different foreign policies, but the more important answer is that some Islamist movements have become a transnational force shaping world order and global North-South relations in important ways. What I'm saying is that in several countries, Islamists reject Western-oriented secular states in favor of governments more explicitly oriented to Islamic values. In this respect, these movements reflect long-standing anti-Western sentiments in these countries against the old European colonizers who were Christian, and are in some ways nationalistic movements expressed through religious channels. In some Middle Eastern countries with authoritarian governments, religious institutions, mosques, have been the only available avenue for political opposition. Religion has therefore become a means to express opposition to the status quo in politics and culture. These anti-Western feelings in Islamic countries came to a boil in 2006 after a Danish newspaper published offensive cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. Across the world, Muslims protested, rioted, and boycotted Danish goods. It is interesting to know that anti-American and anti-Western sentiments in predominantly Islamic countries have accelerated the growth of violent Islamist groups as well. Although they are in the minority, they have disproportional effects on international politics. Armed Islamist groups vary tremendously, and some cases violently disagree with another. In particular, divisions between the Sunni and Shiite sects of Islam have led to violence, especially in and around Iraq. In Iran, a popular uprising in 1979 overthrew the US-backed Shah and installed an Islamic government in which the top religious leaders, ayatollahs, can overturn the laws passed by the parliament. In sum, conflicts involving Islamist movements are more complex than simply religious conflicts. They concern power, economic relations, ethnic chauvinism, and historical empires as well. Ideological factor. Ideological extremism is also characterized by beliefs in a particular ideological disposition. The bipolarity of the world after World War II is as a result of differences in ideology. Put simply, the Cold War was a global ideological struggle between capitalist democracy and communism, led by the United States and former Soviet Union. Similarly, ideology and political philosophies do play some role in international politics. Ideologies can help mobilize national populations, such as in war. For instance, fascism inflamed German nationalism before World War II, legitimizing German aggression by placing it in an ideological framework, and in some proxy wars of the Cold War era, such as Vietnam in the 1960s and Nicaragua in the 1980s, the rebels and governments had real ideological differences. Territorial acquisition disputes. Among the international conflicts that concern tangible goods, those about territory have special importance because of the territorial nature of the state and sovereignty. Conflicts over control of territory are really of two varieties. Territorial disputes about where borders are drawn and conflicts over control of entire states within existing borders. Inasmuch states values home territory with an almost fanatical devotion, border disputes tend to be among the most intractable in international relations. The value states place on home territory seems undiminished despite the apparent reduction in the inherent value of territory as technology has developed. Historically, territory was the basis of economic production. Therefore, winning and losing wars meant gaining or losing territory, which also meant increasing or decreasing wealth. Today, however, much more wealth derives from the trade and technology than from agriculture.